Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into a really powerful study out of Sri Lanka today. It asks a pretty tough but crucial question. When a woman faces sexual violence from her partner, what happens next? What does she do? The answers? Well, they might not be what you expect. Let's dig in. Okay, let's start with just one number, 20.4%. So what is that? Well, according to a recent major survey in Sri Lanka, that's how many women who've ever had a partner have experienced physical or sexual violence. Let that sink in for a second. That's literally 1 out of every 5 women. It's a huge number, and we really need to understand what's behind it.
So yeah, how do we get from a cold statistic like that to the actual human stories behind it? Well, that's exactly what this research starts to unpack for us.
The study zeroes in on something very specific: intimate partner sexual violence, or IPSV. You know, this is a kind of violence that so often happens in private, behind closed doors, and it goes completely unspoken. But this research, it's starting to crack that silence open.
So how are they doing that? Well, the researchers took a close look at the survey responses from 148 women who reported experiencing this kind of violence. And they were really focused on one key question. When this happens, what's the next step? What do you actually do?
And right here, this is where the data shows us something really important and, frankly, pretty troubling. There's this massive gap between a woman speaking up and her getting any kind of formal institutional help.
Get this, almost 80%, nearly 80% of these women did break the silence. They told somebody what was going on. I mean, that's a huge step, right? That's the vast majority.
So who are they telling? A lot of the time, it's who you'd expect: close family, parents or siblings. But here's something that really stands out. More than half of them also went to the police. That's a big deal. It shows that women are really trying to find help from anywhere they can. But this is where that gap I mentioned really comes into focus. This flowchart from the study paints a really clear picture. Just because a woman discloses what's happening, tells a parent, tells the police, that doesn't automatically lead to getting formal help. For a lot of them, sadly, that's kind of where the road stops. Okay, so let's just lay these numbers out side by side to see it clearly. We have almost 80% who told someone. But then, less than half, just under 50%, actually sought formal help. So what is going on in that gap? What's the barrier that's preventing them from taking that critical next step? Well, the study starts to give us some really tough answers, and spoiler alert, a lot of it comes down to these incredibly powerful social and cultural pressures that these women are under. And this, right here, this phrase really says it all: bringing a bad name to the family. This was the single most common reason women gave. The fear of shame, of bringing dishonor on their family, was a massive wall. And you can see it quantified right here in this chart. It's not just a feeling, it's a measurable fear. Look at that. The concern for the family's reputation is by far the #1 reason women gave for not seeking help. So you've got over a third worried about family shame. Then another big chunk, more than 21%, were just afraid of being embarrassed, or worse, being blamed for what happened to them. And then there's this last one, which is, honestly, it's heartbreaking. Nearly 1/5 of them didn't get help because they thought the violence was just normal or not serious enough. So, okay, where does that leave us? What about the women who do manage to push past all these barriers? Where do they end up going for help? And what can their choices tell us about what needs to change? All right, so of the women who did seek formal help, the police were by far the #1 destination. Over 76% went there. Hospitals were next, which makes sense, for injuries. But what really jumps out here is that fewer than 10% went to specialized social or legal services. That's a tiny number. It really makes you wonder, right? Are these services not available? Are they not well known? Are they just not trusted? And this next point is absolutely crucial. The researchers found that this reluctance to get help, it had nothing to do with a woman's age, her level of education, or what she did for a living. It just didn't matter. This is an issue that cuts across every single demographic. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, the bottom line is that this is not just about individual women making individual choices. The solution is way more complicated than just telling someone to just leave. Of course, it's about empowering women, but it's also about something much, much bigger. It's about changing the fundamental attitudes of a community, the very fabric of a society that lets this happen in the first place.
And that's really the provocative question this research leaves us with, isn't it? It forces us to think beyond just setting up more support services. If the vulnerability to this violence and the silence that surrounds it is tied more to a woman's gender than to anything else about her, then what on earth does it take to change an entire society's attitudes?